The second space is an installation or a sculptural work consisting in a beam inlaid with 3 trajectories made of brass. And it's usually presented suspended with belts, which are also part of the installation somehow, which I will talk about. So the beam itself is a material that somehow contains history, a part of the history of Lebanon and a part of the history of my own family and childhood, which I often talk about in my works. So the beam was a structural element in a house that used to be a storage for my family, who used to have shops in the souks of Beirut prior to the civil war. So the beam was a part of the roof structure, and when the civil war happened, the house was torn down, and my father took up this beam to our family house in the mountain of Lebanon. So I was very interested when I made the work in the trajectory that the beam itself followed. So it was an essential element in a house. It then became sort of a decorative element in the family house because it was installed high up, but like near the ceiling, but it didn't have any function anymore. Still, it came with all the history that it had witnessed. So it witnessed somehow the fastest era that Lebanon went through, the downfall somehow, and also the aftermath of the war. And then it also witnessed my whole childhood, because when I was born, the beam was already installed in that house. And it's the only element that my father was able to salvage from that house. The wood of the beam is also a wood that's called in Arabic atrane, which doesn't get affected by bugs or time. So it's a very strong wood. The full story of the beam is that, and I was interested also in the directions that it took and the way it went. So it was up in the roof in Beirut. It was torn down. It was taken up to the mountain in Lebanon. It was installed again like up near the ceiling. And then at some point, it was taken down as well and just stored in the stairs. And here you can see that the wood was not really affected because it's that strong wood. And it stayed in the stairs for around 20 years. And I always had the idea of doing something out of it. I was interested in the fact that it was not a new material that I was going to use for a sculpture or for an artwork, but that it was a material full of all of this history. I mean, my personal history I use a lot as a departure point in my works, because it's a way to approach the history of Lebanon, a wider history, through the lens of the child that I was at that time, which is the only point of view that I can have to talk about that period and that moment of Lebanon's history. So I decided to combine the beam with these 3 trajectories that I inlaid in the wood. So staying a bit faithful to the tradition, like craftsy traditions that we have here, Oriental traditions that also exist elsewhere, of course. So I had the chance to have like a ma'alim, like a master, to come and carve the trajectory into the wood, because of course it's materials that are unique. It's one piece that I have, and I can't afford to have somebody make a mistake with it, or I can't make tests in advance. So he came, he carved the trajectories out. The brass trajectories are laser cut for them to be very precise. They have to be very precise. And then they were inserted in the beam. I wanted to stay close to these traditions, and very often it's brass inlays in wood. So this is something that already exists that I try to work on too. Existing techniques, usually very precious ornamental techniques, which I use in a different way. So the brass, of course, it's the color of gold. It evokes something precious. It's also polished in a way that it's mirroring you. Of course, with time that evolves, and it's a choice whether to polish them again or to leave them merge a bit more in the wood. So that's a choice that can be made. Yeah, apart from the preciousness, it's techniques that I like to revisit. So the inlays, whether it's brass or mother of pearl, that we are very familiar with here in the Middle East or even in Lebanon, and that I try to use in a less decorative and more meaningful way. I had to choose locations on the beams in order to choose where the trajectories would go. And for that, I kind of made a parallel, also for their thickness, between not only the history of the beam, but the history of what the beam was initially, a tree with veins, which also address the growth of that tree. And then these lines, these trajectories that become somehow patterns. So if you look at it a bit from close, you can see that you have the veins, the lines, the veins of the wood, and then the trajectories that are a bit in dialogue with them. So the growth of the tree and my own growth as a child going to school, because they are the three routes that I took as a child to go to school. Not that I was expelled from school 3 times, but the school, because of what was happening, the events taking place in Lebanon, changed location 3 times. So it was initially in another school in the mountain, the Brumana High School, and then it was renting part of another school. So that's the smallest trajectory. Then the school was built also in the mountain, and then we were able to go back down to Beirut because the war had ended since a while then. Usually when I install the beam, I try to have, I think about the order, this order. But of course, and that's where the title of the work came from, the second space, the routes don't exist anymore on a map, on the space of a map. They have to interact with that new space which they are on now. So just to go back to the routes themselves, they are of course not the Google Maps or the GPS itineraries that would be proposed today. So there's a whole part of the work which is tracing back the roads that we used to take at that time. And it's sometimes extremely subjective because it can be the route that your parents prefer to take, whereas other people would take another route. But it's also connected to 2 other factors. The roads that existed at that time, which are different from today, because today there are highways that have been made that didn't exist then. And it's also very specifically the trajectories to go to school. So the roads that the school bus would take, going to pick up that pupil, then that other pupil, etc. So it's really they're very particular somehow. And I considered tattooing a little bit, like it's a kind of retroactive tattoo on the wood, but also on it's somehow my own body that has been very much affected by going back and forth around, like following these routes passively, because I was not the one driving, for years. And for this, I think they are somehow the most meaningful of the trajectories that I used, because they were done the most often. The installation itself includes the belts that I mentioned in the beginning. So the last trip that the beam made, and not the last, but the first time it was exhibited, it was taken back down from the mountain to Beirut. And somehow this also was meaningful for the artwork. And I decided to keep the same belts that were used to take it down. It was a kind of crazy enterprise to take it back down because it's extremely heavy. It needed 6 people to carry it. It needed trucks, etc. And so I bought the worn belts from the person who transported the beam. He was very surprised. And I decided to install it horizontally because I always like to transform. It's a bit of a landscape. It becomes a bit of a landscape. And I wanted to install it halfway a bit between ground and ceiling to evoke a bit all that it had been through. Then there are only 3 routes. Each one is on one side of the beam, and then there's a side that is left empty also. And one has to create connections and imagine also what is this new space, what is this second space that is not a map anymore. This is a very important aspect of my work as well, because I depart from extremely personal, the departure point is extremely personal. It's my own story, also the story of my country. But then what I offer to the public, what I show, is very abstract. So as I was saying, the roots, they are a way to obtain, in the end, just patterns. It's a way to evoke even sculpture, but also drawing, simply. They are disposed a bit freely on the surface of the beam, on the new surface. And also, there's no indication, there's no cartographic indication anymore. So nobody can retrace the direction that these trajectories were made, or where they used to start, where they used to end. I say that they depart from the family house, but this is also an information that is not disclosed. So, yeah, it's in the end what I present is a kind of mirror, or a kind of a pretext for the visitor, the public, the spectator, to remember his own childhood, teenagehood, or his own story, wherever he or she come from.